Was Richard the Lionheart truly a hero, or just a really, really bad gambler with England's fortune? Did a bunch of greedy nobles actually orchestrate a medieval money heist? And could a cathedral become a vault for melted down silver and a stage for political drama? Let's dive into the chaotic, glittering, and utterly bizarre story of how England paid the ransom to free its king from an emperor's clutches. It started with a shipwreck, didn't it? Richard, the flamboyant king, found himself marooned off the coast of Scotland in 1191, a rather inconvenient setback for his plans to, well, pretty much everything. While he was busy dodging angry Scots and nursing his ego, his wife, Eleanor, stepped up to the plate, and it wasn't a dainty china plate either. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who'd once ruled her own duchy and had a knack for getting involved in royal dramas, became the architect of England's desperate fundraising campaign. She wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole situation, but she understood the stakes. A king captured, a kingdom potentially destabilized, and a whole lot of angry emperors breathing down their necks. The first wave of panic hit York with a vengeance. Imagine a city already simmering with religious fervor, the Second Crusade was raging, and everyone was feeling a bit intense. Add to that a healthy dose of simmering resentment towards the Jewish financiers who'd been quietly building their wealth and influence, and you've got a recipe for disaster. The Jewish community, already facing suspicion and prejudice, became the immediate scapegoat. Rumors spread like wildfire. Jews were deliberately fueling the emperor's demands, manipulating the situation for their own gain. It wasn't entirely unfounded. Jewish financiers were heavily involved in lending money to the English aristocracy, including the very nobles who were now desperately trying to raise the ransom. The situation escalated quickly, culminating in a horrifying act of ritualistic violence, the burning of debt bonds in the nave of York Minster. Picture it, a sacred space filled with candles, now ablaze with the flames of religious mania and simmering financial desperation. It was a terrifying symbol of the kingdom's unraveling, but this wasn't just a religious frenzy. Beneath the surface of the panic, a darker game was being played. A group of minor aristocratic families, drowning in debt, saw an opportunity. They weren't necessarily fans of Richard, but they were fans of avoiding bankruptcy. By blaming the Jews, they could deflect attention from their own financial woes and potentially gain influence. The outrage in York wasn't just about religious persecution. It was about desperate men trying to save their estates, their titles, their very livelihoods. Enter Philip of Poitou, Richard's loyal and slightly hapless companion from the shipwreck. He was tasked with escorting the wealthiest Jewish financiers of Winchester to London, a rather delicate diplomatic mission. Imagine a gaggle of nervous, heavily insured bankers being ushered into the heart of the kingdom, their fortunes hanging in the balance. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and anxiety. The financiers, acutely aware of their precarious position, knew that if they were accused of manipulating the ransom, their lives and their businesses would be forfeit. A special tax was decreed, 3,000 to 5,000 marks, a colossal sum of money in those days. It wasn't just a tax, it was a demand for a portion of their entire wealth, a blatant attempt to bleed the Jewish community dry, and it wasn't just the Jews. A special tax on gold was levied, hitting goldsmiths and early bankers particularly hard. These were the people who controlled the flow of money, the keepers of England's burgeoning financial system. They were suddenly caught in the crosshairs of a desperate kingdom. The administrative burden of raising the ransom fell on the bishops and sheriffs, the usual gatekeepers of royal revenue. Bishops tasked with extracting funds from the clergy and sheriffs responsible for collecting taxes from everyone else. It was a monumental task compounded by the fact that they were also juggling their regular duties, maintaining order, dispensing justice, and generally keeping the peace. The Royal Exchequer set up a parallel operation, utilizing a giant chessboard, a proto-abacus, to track the flow of funds. Sheriffs from every county were expected to justify their accounts, a process that must have been incredibly tedious and prone to corruption. And then there were the tally sticks, 9-inch pieces of hazel wood, meticulously carved with notches representing different sums. Each transaction was recorded on a pair of sticks, one kept by the sheriff, the other by the recipient. A rather ingenious system, but one that also created a vast trail of evidence, a trail that could be easily manipulated or lost. But here's where things got truly strange. England was experiencing a period of unprecedented inflation. The influx of silver pennies from across Europe, thanks to Henry II's mint master, Isaac the Jew, was flooding the market. This wasn't a gradual increase in prices, it was a sudden, dramatic surge. Oxen, once valued at 3 shillings, now cost double. Wheat became ridiculously expensive. Knights were paid twice what they'd received a generation before. It was chaos. Landlords tied to fixed rents were suddenly facing skyrocketing costs. Their incomes were dwindling, while their expenses were soaring. Peasants struggling to make ends meet were increasingly squeezed by rising rents. This inflation wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a social revolution in the making. It was the engine driving the decline of feudal payments, forcing landowners to demand higher and higher rents in cash. The ransom office, a separate entity from the exchequer, meticulously tracked the flow of funds using the chessboard abacus and tally sticks. But the records are lost, vanished into the mists of time. Imagine countless pipe rolls sewn together like a massive scroll, documenting every transaction, every payment, every delay. The sheer scale of the operation is staggering. Now let's talk about the hostages. Richard had agreed to provide 200 initially to the Emperor and Leopold. Getting these young men to Germany was a logistical nightmare. They weren't just being sent on a goodwill tour, they were essentially bargaining chips, a guarantee that Richard would fulfill his obligations. But simply choosing hostages wasn't easy. They had to be valuable, either wealthy, influential, or simply useful, to ensure the ransom was actually paid. Eleanor, Richard's formidable wife, took on the task of recruiting and dispatching the hostages. It was a grueling process, filled with bitter disputes, refusals, and appeals. The final agreement stipulated that only 60 hostages would be sent to the Emperor and 7 to Leopold, a more achievable target. The list of hostages was carefully curated, reflecting the political realities of the time. The two most powerful figures in the government, the Chief Justiciar and the Chancellor Walter of Coutances and William Longchamp, were at the top. Longchamp, a notorious figure known for his ruthlessness and penchant for pederasty, was a particular problem. Some families refused to send their sons into his care, fearing for their safety. The message was clear: we appreciate your offer, but we'd rather risk the Emperor's wrath than expose our children to your attentions. Other hostages included Fernando of Navarre, Henry of Saxony's eldest son, and Otto, Richard's favorite nephew. Otto was a key player in Aquitaine, a region of strategic importance. The list also included William of Winchester, Richard's friend Baldwin of Bethune, and Bishop Savaric of Bath. There was even a 4-year-old boy, a cousin of the Count of Hainault, who was swiftly removed from Eleanor's care. And then there was Hugh de Morville, a knight with a particularly dark past, the man who, along with 3 friends, had murdered Thomas Becket. His inclusion on the list was a chilling reminder of the kingdom's troubled past. The negotiation for hostages was a messy, protracted affair, filled with political maneuvering and personal grudges. The main obstacle was Longchamp's reputation. It was simply impossible for some families to entrust their sons to a man known for his predatory behavior. Longchamp predictably didn't take the news well. He promptly returned to England, eager to escape the shadow of the hostages. His arrival was met with hostility. Abbot Samson refused to allow him to celebrate Mass at Bury St. Edmunds, fearing the wrath of St. Edmund. Longchamp was blocked from entering London, forced to negotiate his entry in St. Albans. Richard's new government refused to offer him the customary kiss of greeting, a symbolic gesture of respect. Finally, Eleanor stepped in, delivering a scathing rebuke to Longchamp. She declared that she would never entrust her grandson to him. The meeting broke up in chaos, and Longchamp was relieved of his role as a hostage and replaced by Baldwin Wake, the silver itself was a strange commodity. It wasn't just delivered as coins, a significant portion was melted down into ingots. This wasn't a simple act of financial prudence. It was a deliberate attempt to control the flow of money and prevent it from being spent on frivolous luxuries. The silver was transported under armed escort, making its way to St. Paul's Cathedral, the beating heart of London. The cathedral, a sprawling, ancient structure, was an unlikely repository for such a vast sum of wealth. It was the city's social, political, and administrative center. The St. Paul's Cross, with its banks of seats, had once hosted the folkmoot, a medieval version of a town council meeting. The cathedral's vaults were rented out to a carpenter and a wine merchant. Behind the high altar, the jewels on St. Erkenwald's tomb were said to cure eye problems, a rather bizarre use for religious relics. Even the font was being used as a counter for settling debts. St. Paul's was far larger than the later building by Sir Christopher Wren. It was a living, breathing testament to London's history, a place where commerce, politics, and religion intersected. But as the silver piled up, a different kind of crisis was brewing: the question of the hostages. Richard had agreed to provide 60 to the emperor and 7 to Leopold. Getting these young men to Germany was a daunting task. They weren't just being sent on a diplomatic mission, they were essentially being held hostage, a guarantee that Richard would fulfill his obligations. Eleanor took on the responsibility of recruiting and dispatching the hostages. It was a difficult process, filled with political maneuvering and personal grudges. Some families refused to send their sons, fearing for their safety. The final agreement stipulated that only 60 hostages would be sent to the emperor and 7 to Leopold, a more achievable target. The negotiations were protracted and fraught with tension. The biggest obstacle was Longchamp's reputation. It was simply impossible for some families to entrust their sons to a man known for his predatory behavior. The story doesn't end there. William of Newburgh, a contemporary chronicler, described the fundraising efforts. The royal officers accelerated the business throughout England without sparing anyone. Privileges, prerogatives, immunities of churches and monasteries were neither pleaded nor admitted. Every dignity, every liberty was silent. The bailiffs appointed by Henry II faced widespread resistance. Local juries, often influenced by landowners, deliberately inflated the tax assessments, pocketing the extra revenue for themselves. This sparked widespread resentment, particularly in the cities, where people felt exploited by the corrupt officials at the top. The situation mirrored the legend of Robin Hood, a folk hero who challenged the authority of the wealthy and powerful. The people saw the ransom as a symbol of injustice, a blatant attempt to bleed the kingdom dry. Adding fuel to the fire was the news that John, Richard's younger brother, had forged a copy of the royal seal and imposed a tax on his own tenants. This was seen as a blatant act of defiance, a further demonstration of the corruption and greed at the heart of the government. The people's anger wasn't directed at the feudal system itself. It was aimed at the behavior of the lords and landowners, who were exploiting their position for personal gain. It was a furious rejection of the established order, a longing for a return to justice and fairness. And then there was the matter of the silver. It wasn't just being stored in the cathedral, it was being melted down into ingots, a deliberate attempt to control the flow of money. The story of Richard's ransom is a bizarre and captivating tale, a story of religious mania, financial desperation, political intrigue, and medieval chaos. It's a reminder that even the most powerful kings are vulnerable to the whims of fortune, and that even the most seemingly stable societies can be brought to the brink of collapse by greed, corruption, and a healthy dose of resentment. So was Richard the Lionheart a hero or a gambler? Perhaps he was a little of both. He was a brave and charismatic warrior, but he was also a reckless spender and a poor judge of character. And the story of his ransom, a story of silver, hostages, and simmering resentment, is a testament to the complex and often contradictory nature of history. But one final question remains. If England could amass such a colossal sum of money in 1191, why do we know so little about exactly how it was raised? The records are gone, swallowed by the relentless march of time. It's a frustrating mystery, a silent testament to the ephemeral nature of power and the enduring secrets of the past.